Well, for that, we turn to a journalist. Joe Simonson, senior investigative reporter for the Washington Free Beacon, joins us now. Joe, good to have you back with us, sir.
Vince, thank you.
Yeah, this one stuck out to me as one of the funnier moments from the Robert Hur transcript, where he was talking about some poor fella who apparently burned his junk off. But give us a kind of a scene setter here for why Joe Biden was talking about this in the first place.
Sure, absolutely, and that's actually kind of important to the extent one can make sense of why Biden goes on these various tangents. But there does seem to be some logic to this one. So, as you know, and your listeners probably know, Biden had a bunch of documents in his house. He took boxes full of stuff from his time as vice president to various offices and homes and things such as that. So Biden had to explain, well, why was that stuff all there? And one of his, and including some classified information, which is why he was in this situation.
Yeah.
And so the question is, well, why did you have all this stuff? And so Biden was telling Special Counsel Hur that, well, I've had a really interesting life. And I'm working on a memoir, and I have this biographer who's doing a book on me, and I never kept a diary. Jill always said I needed to keep a diary, but I didn't keep a diary. And that is how I ended up with all these documents in my house, and some classified stuff got thrown in there. And so part of his rationale for telling these stories is, well, I mean, you wouldn't believe the kind of stuff I've seen in my very long and storied career. And one of the things, and this is his political origin story, is the scene is 1968, and Biden graduated from Syracuse Law School. His grades were not good, as we know, and he failed a class for plagiarizing. But he was so good looking, according to Joe Biden, they actually got an offer from a real estate development firm. But here's the catch.
Yeah.
They wouldn't hire him until he passed the bar. So he says, okay, no problem. I'll go back home. I'll go to Wilmington, and I'll join this local high-powered firm that does a lot of high-profile litigation. And Biden says, I was thinking about being a Republican at the time. I was even a Republican for 5 minutes. And he helped organize the Christmas party, and all the partners there were Republicans. But a case comes across the firm's desk. And as you said, this young man, 23 years old, was a welder, and he suffered this horrific accident. All this fluid got on his pants and lit on fire while he was working in a vessel, and he burned off his most of his lower torso, his genitalia, as you alluded to.
Mm-hmm.
So the partner at the firm says, Joe, you're new here. Why don't you draft a memo and show why this guy was negligent, and we'll win the case. And Joe says, okay, no problem. He does it. Basically, a day later, they show up in court, and the judge tosses out the case, and Biden looks over, and the crying wife and the two kids are there. They're getting nothing. So then right after, he walks out with the partner, and the partner says, Joe, let's go get lunch. Great job. And Biden says the only time he's ever lied was when he told that partner, I can't. My dad's in town. I got to get lunch with him. Instead of going to lunch with his father, he says he marches across to another building, quits his job at the firm, and becomes a public defender that very day. None of this happened.
Well, I'm sorry, hold up. I want to get to this. I love the big reveal, which is that this is all a lie. Oh, that's hilarious. I can't wait to get to it. But I do love this moment that he told Robert Hur that the only moment he's ever lied in his entire career was about going to get lunch with his dad.
Yes, that's the only time. It's the only time I ever looked at someone in the eye. I swear to God, and I lied right there. And he repeats that line in his biography as well.
This is a guy whose entire career is defined by lying. I mean, everything. Go back to his presidential campaign in the late 1980s. He has to leave the presidential race because he lied about the speeches he was giving. I mean, the guy's lying nonstop.
Correct. Yeah. That's the only time he can.
That's the only time he's ever lied. Okay, got it.
And so this stuck out to me and my colleague, Andrew Kerr, and I think we discussed it last time I was on air. And, I thought, I said, do you think we could find this case? I mean, it's why he's in public service. He says, it's like, and that's why I became a public defender. That's why I realized the laws are wrong. I need to change them. That's why Joe Biden's in the White House today.
Yes, because he screwed over this guy who had his junk burned off by this mean company. And he was like, you know what? I feel so bad about what happened there. I need to turn everything around. I need to fight for the little guy now. I need to fight for him.
So we spent a very long time. We went through the National Archives. We called up all these courts. But we found something. We found the case, but we also found something more interesting. We found a news article in Joe Biden's local newspaper about a welder who faced severe burns in his lower torso and was represented, and sued his employer, the same employer that he mentions in his memoir and in the Robert Hur's interview.
Yeah.
And here's the problem. The case reached a jury verdict in April 1968, and Joe Biden didn't graduate law school until June 1968. And guess what? The welder won. He won like $300,000, which is like $3 million too. He got a huge settlement. Now, it's obviously terrible. The guy was in a wheelchair the rest of his life. It's all that. But the story, none of this happened in the way in Joe Biden's telling. And so what we think is very likely is that he just stole this story for himself, and no one's ever called him out on it.
Well, he stole it, but he also distorted it too. He reinvented the outcome. He said that the guy lost the case when in fact he actually won and got a pretty handsome sum of money out of the company for his injuries.
That's exactly right. And Biden's telling the reason the guy lost is because Biden's so smart and such a great litigator.
It's just added to the pile. By the way, just on the origin story thing, hasn't Biden told a million different political origin stories? Didn't he say he was marching in the civil rights movement? And he's told a lot of these, hasn't he?
He has a lot. A lot of them do seem to, one time it was when he was like a lifeguard and there were like a lot of black families at the pool and he thought it was terrible that they were like poorer. And then another one is his public defender. He wanted to become a public defender. Then apparently he actually told another interviewer in 1987 that he wanted to be in politics since he was an undergrad in college. So his origin story is changes by the year. But this one in particular,
it's like one of these multiverse movies, and Joe Biden is the star in all of them. Yeah.
But this one in particular was kind of the most compelling, right? I mean, it's such a crazy story, and it's something out of a movie. Like, I win this case. I have all this promise. I feel so bad about it, and I quit my job that day and become a public defender. But it never happened.
It never happened. It never happened. So you dug into this, and then you asked all the relevant parties, how do they account for themselves? What did they say?
Well, so we called the firm he worked at. So we found the case also. We found that case, and there was no appeal or whatever. It's very straightforward. So we called his law firm that he worked at, which is still exists. A slightly different name now. Some of the name partners have changed. And they say, oh, yeah, we're not familiar with the Robert Hur testimony, but we know that he's mentioned this before. He said, but they said, unfortunately, we can't confirm this happened because our records don't go back that long. And we went to the National Archives and we said, hey, can you find this case? And they find it. And we did all this searching on various legal databases. We called 2 different circuit courts where the case would have been tried. And we said, well, do you have anything else of these fact patterns? And, what are the odds that 2 guys would have, had these horrific burns working at the exact same construction company, both being welders, basically within a year of each other? And they can't find it. And what's interesting, too, is that the language Biden uses to describe what happened to this guy, he says he was cleaning a vessel. And vessel is kind of an interesting word, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't like he was in a smokestack. It wasn't like, whatever. He used the word vessel. And guess where that word first appeared? In the 1968 news article in his local paper.
So it's possible that he just read this story and said, that's a fun story. Now it's mine?
I have no idea. It's possible he read the story. It's possible that when he joined, he did work at the firm. When he joined the firm, there were case documents lying around, and he just familiarized himself with it. Maybe the partners at the firm were complaining about it, right? Maybe they're like, I can't believe we lost this case, blah, 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 blah. I don't know where he got the idea. I know that it was at the firm he worked at, but I know that there is no way that he could have been involved in the case.
Okay, so what is the White House saying? What is the Biden campaign saying? How are they accounting for Joe Biden's remarks to a federal investigator?
Oh, Vince, they haven't gotten back to me. They've read my email 50 times. I have a tracker on the emails that I send, a little extension. They've read it. They know.
Don't tell people that, Joe, because then they'll stop opening your emails at all. Then they'll be like, oh no, he's tracking how many times they're reading it. But you've already said it, so you can't put the cat back in the bag. 50 times.
That's
now
true.
The White House has read your email 50 times, and they refuse to actually send you an answer of any substance or any answer at all at this point.
Well, no, and what someone pointed out to me, a friend of mine pointed out, he said, the funny thing is that in the 0.0001% chance, it's probably even smaller than that, that there was some identical case that Biden, worked on in the same construction company, blah, blah, blah. That means that the White House then has to come out and be like, oh yeah, no, actually Joe Biden did screw over some other guy. But like I said, I think it's nearly impossible that there was some identical case that we can't find. No one can find. The law he worked at can't find. No one can find. So
okay.
I think they're an awkward.
So you've established all of the facts here, which is that Biden quite obviously lied to Robert Hur. Are there consequences to that? Like if it was a normal person, if it wasn't Joe Biden, if it was someone who wasn't a sympathetic elder man who with a poor memory, if you lie to a special counsel, are there legal consequences for that?
Yeah, absolutely. And there were FBI agents also at that at his testimony, and I think a lot of people remember high-profile cases where people lie to a federal agent and get charged. It's a federal offense. Martha Stewart went to prison for this. That's how they got Michael Flynn. Mm-hmm. And so this is a common prosecutorial tactic, right? You lie about something little that's not even necessarily germane to why you're in the room, and they grab you. They have you there, right? And it's like, oh, well, I know you lied about that. Why don't you start talking? And, I'm not saying that, like, obviously, I expect the DOJ to bring charges against them, but,
yeah.
And unfortunately, it's very silly. I think last time I was on, I talked about how he also said he, hit a target in Mongolia for bow and arrow hundreds of yards away. That didn't happen either.
That
right?
didn't happen, no.
So, we have two demonstrable lies in this interview, and again, it's silly. It's a Mongolian archery, it's a guy who burned off his junk, all that. But the point, though, of these lies is to explain why he had all these documents.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and why he stole them in the first place. So he's offering explanations, and the explanations themselves are lies. How is the rest of the media covering this today? This is a great report, by the way. I read it, and I was like, we've got to have Joe on. You wrote it alongside the fabulous Andrew Kerr, too, who deserves a lot of credit here. Are the rest of the press picking this up? Because it's the kind of story that, if the parties were reversed, the New York Times would be all over.
Well, that's great that's so interesting that you bring up the New York Times, because the New York Times wrote up Biden's interview when it came out, and the headline was Biden's amazing life, essentially, from archery to this to that. And the kicker, this is from the New York Times. I know. I feel like I'm going. I sound crazy when I tell it to people who aren't plugged in.
Uh-huh.
And the kicker in this New York Times piece, the last two paragraphs were, and he recounted a story about this horrific injury, blah blah, and then it's like, and the next thing you know, he's in the White House, and it's like, you didn't bother looking into this at all.
Wait, they yada 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 did the man burns his junk off story right to Biden's in the White House now. I love that.
Well, they were so inspired by it. It's like we're supposed to be so amazed that this happened. And then I saw, and I'll leave it at this. But I looking up, I was like, who else has reported on this story? Because he mentions it in his official biography. And I think it was BuzzFeed News or NBC or something or whatever was talking about his work as a public defender. Yeah. And they talk about this case with this welder. And the reporter even writes, and the reporter writes, and it was like something out of a John Grisham novel. I'm like, yeah, it is like something out of a John Grisham novel. Yeah. It didn't happen. You didn't bother checking.
It's so crazy. It's so crazy. Yeah. So he starts his career with a castrated welder and ends it with a castrated media. That's where we are now. Hey, Joe Simonson, thank you very much for actually still doing the hard work and digging in on these questions. Really appreciate your time and the effort at the Washington Free Beacon. Thank you, sir.